Here to celebrate and launch Jasen Castillo's new book, Endurance and War, the National Sources of Military Cohesion. There's nothing like good timing, because when Jasen wrote this book and published it, the Islamic State hadn't quite started marching across Iraq. For anyone who cares, and that should be everyone, about what is happening in the Middle East, read this book. It talks about why military forces are effective, and conversely, why they are not effective. What makes a difference and what doesn't. And I will leave it to our very distinguished panel to elucidate these themes. I would simply say that, to quote another distinguished author, as we have moved from the Cold War to the Long War in Afghanistan and Iraq, we are dealing with the Taliban and the Islamic State as two excellent examples of endurance and cohesion. If we want to beat them, read the book. Dr. Gallus.
Thank you all for coming. It's my job to introduce our distinguished panel and to afterwards take the lead in organizing questions, which I'm sure you will have many. I'm going to start by introducing the panel and then asking our two commentators to come to the podium where they will have some reflections on the book. Then Professor Castillo will have some reactions to their reflections. We then open it up to questions and discussion. We are very pleased to have with us today Professor Austin Long, who's an assistant professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He's currently on leave from Columbia, having received a Council on Foreign Relations Fellowship to spend a year on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon, working on nuclear strategy issues. He previously worked as an associate political scientist for the RAND Corporation, serving in Iraq as an analyst and advisor to the multinational force in Iraq and to the U.S. military. He's the author of a couple of seminal RAND studies, From Cold War to Long War, Lessons from 6 Decades of RAND Research, and On Other War, Lessons from 5 Decades of RAND Counterinsurgency Research. He was the co-founder of the Working Group on Insurgency and Irregular Warfare at the MIT Center for International Studies, and is a participant in the RAND Counterinsurgency Board of Experts. He received his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Our second speaker today will be joining us from not quite as far away as the Pentagon. Professor Arnold Kramer is professor of history here at Texas A&M, having joined the faculty in 1979. He has published, edited, or co-edited 12 books and authored well over 40 articles and book chapters. He has also won just about every teaching award there is here at Texas A&M. So he is a real Aggie institution. His main field of research is modern German history. And we're extremely pleased that he journeyed over to the west end of campus to join us today. And finally, last but not least, the guest of honor today is Professor Jasen Castillo, who is an associate professor here at the Bush School and the author of Endurance and War, the National Sources of Military Cohesion, published by Stanford University Press in their very prestigious Security Studies series. The book came out earlier this year. This is kind of a postmodern book event. In 20th century book events, there would be a table in the back, piled high with copies of the book. But you'll be interested to know that the book is so popular that we couldn't find a copy between Houston and Austin. I think it's because it's selling out the minute it hits the shelves. That's it. But this being a postmodern book event, you can take out your smartphone and with a couple of pushes of buttons, you can order that book from Amazon. So feel free. Usually we would say at a public event like this, turn your phones off and put them away. But for this event, if you are ordering the book, I invite you to keep your phone on. Log on to Amazon and hit that button to buy the book. Professor Long.
Well, thanks very much. It's a great opportunity to be here. I've known Jason for about 10 years since we were both at the RAND Corporation. I read earlier versions of this book and loved it then, and I think I love it even more now that I see the final product. So congratulations, Jason. It's great to see it out. So I'm not going to take up too much time because I think we'll have a good discussion, but I want to touch on four sort of main areas. One, I want to situate the book in the broader literature and sort of tell you why this book is so important. I mean, everybody tells you that the book they're here to celebrate is important, but this really is an important book, and it's a major milestone in the social study of militaries and warfare. So I want to highlight sort of why that is. I'll sort of briefly recap a couple of the theoretical points for the book just so we can have a little bit of discussion about them. Then I'll sort of talk about my experience in Iraq at various points and observations from the Iraq conflict that I think are very consonant with the book's themes. And as Dean Crocker mentioned, you can see a lot of these theoretical components in Iraq today, but I'll give you sort of a little more background on Iraq and how the book applies there. And then I'll conclude with a few questions and comments that maybe we can get to in Q&A, sort of directed at Jason, but also more broadly. So why is this book so important? I'll start with probably the seminal article in the field of understanding why military organizations hang together in combat. And I know many of you probably have family in the military or have served yourself, but for those who haven't, combat is an extraordinarily unnatural event, right? You're asking people to run towards the sound of gunfire rather than away from it, to risk life and limb for what are often fairly abstract political ideals. It's a really unusual thing to do. So getting young men and now young women as well to hang together in the face of unbelievable hardship is quite difficult. And yet military organizations are fundamentally built to do that. So the seminal work in the field comes out of research during and after World War II. It's an article by two guys, Schulz and Janowitz, from 1948. And the reason I highlight 1948, we're coming up on essentially the 70th anniversary of this article, and yet it's still the seminal work in the field. This does not suggest, even though it's a great article, enormous advances in our understanding of why military organizations hang together. And I don't think Schulz and Janowitz, either one, would have expected that 70 years later, their work would still be the one that's cited and argued about, because they used a very limited sample of folks. They basically interviewed German prisoners of war that were all captured on the Western Front. And in essence, they said, why did you guys eventually surrender? And based on that, they decided it was because that organizations held together based on primary bonds, the bonds between you and the guy to your left and the guy to your right, not because of any great ideals about nationalism, etc. There have been some advances in the field since then. People like Omer Barkov have pushed back against this and said, in fact, no, if you look at the other parts of the German war machine, the one that was more or less obliterated by the Red Army on the Eastern Front, they did hold together for these reasons. They've become intensely infused with an ideology that held them together. The point I'm making is this is a seminal work because it takes these insights from both Barkov, Schulz and Janowitz, and others, and advances them, and more importantly, it puts them together in a coherent framework. And that's the really significant advance from a social science perspective of this book, is why do armies hang together? And so I'll briefly recap the theory, just give us grounds for discussion for those of you who haven't read the book. Jason's basic argument is that there are sort of two main variables that determine this. One is essentially the level of control that a society has over its citizenry, right? To the extent that they're infused with ideology, to the extent that they're real true believers that can hold together even in the face of conflict. And the entire society doesn't have to equally be infused with this. We just have to have a sufficient critical mass of those who believe in whatever ideology, be it Nazism, or radical Islam or whatever. But these folks will help hold together the organization. They're fundamentally the glue. And then the other piece of the puzzle is essentially a variable that looks at professionalization and how much rope the civilian government feels it can give to the military. Because, of course, militaries are a classically double-edged sword, right? And they're your best friends in wartime and absolutely necessary, but for civilians, they can often turn on you. So some civilian organizations don't feel much comfort in giving a lot of rope to these military organizations. They keep them on very short leashes. It makes it very hard to develop certain levels of combat effectiveness. On the other hand, where I am now in the Pentagon, we have a great deal of confidence that our military is not going to turn on the civilian leadership, even if they may grumble and scuff their shoe occasionally when they're given orders they don't like. They will always carry it out. And that confidence allows you to build very strong professional military. So Jasen basically says this combination of variables can tell you a lot about how cohesive armies are. And so he characterizes them basically into 4 buckets. The best from a cohesion standpoint are what he calls messianic armies. These are armies where they have both the strong ideology and the strong professionalism. And the example there are the Germans in World War II. They fought on against literally overwhelming odds. I mean, Germany bit off vastly more than it could chew, and yet the army fought it out more or less to the bitter end without falling apart, remaining tremendously effective in the face of overwhelming odds. Sort of a step down for that are organizations where they have a very high professional component, but they don't have so much of that ideology infused into them. And the example Jasen gives here is the U.S. Army in Vietnam. A very professional military, one that was very effective, but we don't have the same level of sort of ideological infusion and control in our society, fortunately, I would say, that Nazi Germany had. So in that case, you have high levels of cohesion, but over the long run, the professionalism starts to break down. And I'll come back to this point in the context of today's wars in a minute, because I have some questions for Jasen about that. Next, you have the authoritarians, which are sort of the reverse. Strong control over the population, don't trust the military any further than they can throw them. Therefore, the military doesn't necessarily become very professional, but it is held together by this ideology. And then finally, you have the worst of all possible worlds, the apathetic military. These guys are the basket cases of the military world, right? No professionalization, no ideology. They don't hold together very well. I think we're seeing a good example of that, unfortunately, in Iraq today. So that's sort of situating the work. Fortunately, in addition to Jasen's work, there's some other work coming out that touch on other elements of cohesion. So I think we're positioned for a real great leap forward, in a sense, in studies of how militaries fight, how militaries hang together, that will hopefully improve our understanding very much going forward. So I encourage you to read the book just for those reasons alone. But I do want to mention some specific concrete examples from Iraq where I think we saw the book more or less in action. And it's always nice to see contemporary as well as historical conflicts where these hold together. So I'll just highlight a few, some of which Jasen mentioned. First, you have Iraq in 2003. The United States faced a fairly significant surprise in the course of that war. No one expected the United States wouldn't win, at least the initial invasion of Iraq. But we were a bit surprised by the different levels of cohesion in bits of the Iraqi military. So the Iraqi regular army was perhaps the dictionary definition of an apathetic army. They couldn't care less about Saddam Hussein and his ideology. He didn't trust them at all, so they had no professionalism. They more or less melted away as quickly as they could take their uniforms. On the other hand, there was a paramilitary organization, some of you may remember, called the Saddam Fedayeen, which, while not particularly professional, they were heavily imbued with, if not real, sort of true blue Ba'athist ideology, at least the ideology of, we like Saddam, he's our patron, we got to make sure he stays in power. And that led them to do some amazingly brave, if suicidal things, like essentially crash pickup trucks into U.S. tanks and run up on them trying to shoot the crew. That's enormously brave. I give them full marks for that, but it's literally suicidal. So that was a surprise. It's not one that derailed the invasion, but it was surprising. And if we had read Jasen's book and sort of had a better study of the different parts of the Iraqi military, it would have been less surprising. And so while that had very little impact in the 2003 war, there are other contexts going forward where that might be more important. Come forward a couple of years to Iraq, circa 2005, 2006, you can see real differentiation in the insurgents that were fighting against the United States. So sort of top of the league table there was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and we'll come back to this hopefully a little more in the discussion, but Al-Qaeda in Iraq, I would argue by Jasen's characteristics, by 2005, 2006, was a messianic organization. Every single member of Al-Qaeda in Iraq was not a true believer, but there was absolutely a hardcore, a cadre of true believers that controlled the rest and kept them in line. At the same time, it evolved from loose networks into a very hierarchical, very disciplined, very, very professional organization. And it was able to stand up to more or less everything the United States could dish out, from special operations missions to very large air assaults to covert action to more or less the entire gamut of things we could throw at them. On the other hand, there were other insurgent organizations, many of which did not look as effective, at least at different points. Organizations like Jasen Castillo, the big Sadrist Shiite militia, they looked much more authoritarian. There were bits that had professionalism, but other bits were much less effective, even though, by virtue of their enthusiasm and willingness to take losses, they were pretty effective. And then even further down in the league table, you had others sort of also ran insurgent organizations that more or less the United States was very effectively able to either destroy or weaken so much that they then would later change sides, joining Al-Qaeda in Iraq and things like that. So I think you can definitely see a real differentiation in the nature of the insurgency in Iraq that, again, Jasen's book would have helped inform. And the final point I'll touch on is Iraq sort of 2010 to today. And one of the big questions over the summer was, of course, why is the Iraqi army falling apart? The United States spent literally billions of dollars, an enormous amount of blood and sweat into trying to build up the Iraqi military. And of course, more or less at the first sort of major surprise attack in Mosul over the summer, it starts to collapse. You have tens of thousands, literally tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers disappear more or less overnight. And the question people were left asking was why? And again, Jasen's book gives a lot of insight into that. On the one hand, you have a lot of the same problems of professionalism that you had under Saddam, right? So the government of Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister at the time, Maliki came from an organization that was just as obsessed with the possibility of coup as Saddam was, and so he kept the military on a relatively short leash. The leadership he promoted were overwhelmingly those that were loyal rather than competent. So on that professionalism metric, the organization didn't score very well. And on the ideology metric, it didn't score very well either, because even though the officers were loyalists, the rank and file were just rank and file, right? They joined maybe for a paycheck, maybe because they thought they might protect their home, and their home in many cases was quite far from Mosul. So when push came to shove, you had this apathetic Iraqi army that was confronted by the Islamic State, which is essentially the reincarnation or successor to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So you had a messianic organization that had, was fresh off these successes it had had in Syria, confronting a very apathetic army. Again, from Jasen's perspective, the answer to why the army fell apart around Mosul is duh. How could it do anything but? So I'll conclude with just a few questions or remarks that maybe we can talk about more in Q&A. First, I wonder what the theory says about the U.S. today, because in contrast to Vietnam, the United States military has been at war in either Iraq or Afghanistan for 13 years, significantly longer than Vietnam, and yet has shown no real signs of the loss of cohesion that you rightly show was happening at the end of Vietnam. Drug use was up at the end of Vietnam. It's still not particularly significant. The force is wearing out. Don't get me wrong, suicide rates are up, divorce rates are up. There's a lot of stress on the force, but you haven't seen the level of disintegration you saw in Vietnam. And I wonder if that says something about armies that are not based on mass mobilization. Most of the armies Jasen looks at are mass mobilization, in other words, draft-based armies, whereas the U.S. Army today, of course, is an all-volunteer force. And so I wonder if there's something about a level of professionalization you can get to if you're an all-volunteer force that sort of transcends the ideology metric. The other point I'll make is, what can we learn about how to break cohesion? Dean Crocker mentioned reading the book as a way to defeat the Islamic State. And so what insights can we get on how one breaks the cohesion of very effective organizations? Certainly leadership targeting, taking out the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Al-Qaeda Central or most of these other organizations has been disruptive, but hasn't led to this degradation in cohesion. So if that's not the answer, what is? And so I'll just throw out are there other ways that we can think about to sort of grind these organizations down? One work by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan talks about, and I don't think this applies in Iraq, but at least maybe some insight from the idea that if you can force these organizations to confront their own people that are resisting them non-violently, it sort of starts to wear down cohesion. And we saw a little bit of that, I think, in Egypt in Tahrir Square. Maybe there are insights we can draw from that. And then finally, this is and understandably so, a very land power or army-centric story, right? It's a story of the cohesion of armies. I wonder, is it relevant to conflicts that are much more based on capital-intensive organizations like navies and air forces? Which, if you're the kind of person that worries about possible conflict in the Western Pacific with unnamed great powers there, that will sort of be that kind of dominant conflict. And so I wonder if we haven't seen the at least temporary eclipse of cohesion in land-based organizations, and maybe we have anything to say about air and navy. And that's all I have, so thanks very much.
Well, I'm here as a historian. First, let me thank the Dean and Victoria and Dr. Stevens in the back. I'm here as a historian. I'd like to find out or see if Jasen's theory applies to the past as well as it does to the future. Jasen's research asks why national militaries differ in their cohesion or will to fight. At its most fundamental level, his theory asks why some groups unite under pressure while others fall apart. As a historian, my interest is to discern the applicability of the cohesion theory to history students. I should tell you, by the way, that I grew up, well, I'm trying to find a way to describe, my father fought in the First World War. Is he that old? Yes, he is. My father fought in the First World War, not on this side, on a different side, but he fought in the First World War. And so I grew up hearing stories about enormous casualties and armies that didn't quit and armies that did quit and mutiny and so on. I'd like to offer the following insights concerning how this theory, Jasen's theory, might help explain differences in non-military detained groups. Since much of my research centers on the Holocaust and German history, it might be useful to understand why some detained groups of Jews rose up and some groups of Jews didn't fight back. I think the case could be made for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as an example of the Messianic military or group. The Warsaw Ghetto saw some 200,000 to 300,000 Polish Jews densely packed into a small section of central Warsaw. Thousands died of rampant disease and starvation. On April 19, 1943, the conditions within the ghetto were ripe for a revolt by the Jews against the Nazis surrounding the ghetto. First, they had a common identity. The inhabitants were all Polish Jews, and they shared a common language and a common religion. Although there was a divisive issue of Zionism, social cleavages were at a minimum. Moreover, in mid-1943, the Nazis routinely transported thousands of aged Jews to be murdered at Treblinka, followed by many thousands more of juveniles and infants, leaving a fighting force of several hundred teenagers in the ghetto. We know that a messianic military or group is characterized by a high level of regime control and a high level of autonomy of the group. In the Warsaw Ghetto, a strong leadership developed as well as a system of norms for collective survival. And in that regard, the Warsaw Jews could be viewed as messianic group to, quote, loyalty and trust inside the group promoted battlefield determination and flexibility. The theory predicts both strong staying power and strong performance, Considering that this revolt was going to be far from a spark, but rather an uprising which lasts for an entire month, from April 19, 1943 until May 16, 1943, the theory holds. The teenage fighting force was given the autonomy it needed to lead the revolt, promoting the cohesion which prevented rapid collapse in the face of certain death. Additionally, they were initially effective against their oppressors, holding off nearly 22,000 SS troops for a month, admittedly at the cost of their lives, while inspiring similar revolts in other ghettos. We could not ask for a greater performance considering the very few resources they had available to them. Let's compare the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto with a similar number of Jews, let's say 200,000, in, say, Auschwitz concentration camp, whose inmates never did revolt. Here we also see the application of Jasen's cohesion theory. First, the concentration camp inmates were hardly unified. Their nationalities varied widely, as did their languages. Their ages ranged from children to the aged, and their backgrounds ranged from criminals to clergymen. There was little to bond the inmates together. We might consider them to fit Jasen's category of an apathetic group, whose criteria are low regime control and low autonomy of the fighters. Peer pressure, in this case, worked to keep the prisoners apart. Despite the very high level of Nazi control over the inmates, we rarely hear of any form of self-government developing within the camps, so one could make the case that within the camps there was a low degree of regime control among the detainees. Additionally, detainees were incarcerated for a variety of reasons, further hindering the development of a cohesive identity. Oppression within the camps, including a drastic lack of resources, of calories, of guns, limited the autonomy of any potential rebels who might band together to lead an uprising. So while the group wasn't apathetic in the commonly understood sense, they lacked the organization or opportunity to mount an effective revolt. The single revolt in one of the Nazi death camps occurred at Sobibor in Poland with the arrival of several hundred Soviet war prisoners. A unified group had arrived. Military men who realized that their fate in German hands was all but sealed. They spoke Russian among themselves, and while they probably hated the Jews around them, they ultimately led 600 prisoners to escape, only half of whom survived. They fit the definition of an authoritarian group, having trained under the control of the Soviet Union that traditionally offered a low level of autonomy to the military with high regime control. Our theory predicts that the Soviet forces imprisoned at Sobibor would enjoy a high degree of battlefield performance with only moderate staying power. Because the escaping inmates were executed on sight, we cannot easily evaluate their staying power. However, considering that the Soviets helped stage the only mass escape from any of the Nazi death camps, producing a calamity so embarrassing to the Germans that the entire camp was plowed under and trees planted to hide its earlier purpose, the Soviet prisoners performed at an admirable level. Thus, it is clear that Jasen's cohesion theory holds true for non-military groups as well as military groups, and would be very useful for historians who are tasked with explaining why events happened in the past rather than our predicting the future. My final comments address opportunities for future research. A great deal of any cohesion theory depends on the strength, in my opinion, of external forces. In military matters, those external forces might be the size of the enemy, or the perception of their strength or ruthlessness. In our case of the Warsaw Ghetto, the murderous intentions of the surrounding SS, as well as the rabid anti-Semitism of the Polish civilians, left the Jews little illusion about their fate, and their homogeneous nature made an uprising possible. At Auschwitz, also in Poland, the external forces were equally menacing, but the lack of inmate cohesion ensured that no rebellion was possible. A recent speaker in my history class, actually last week, a Holocaust survivor from Houston named Al Marks, related an experience of his concentration camp stay in Austria at a camp called Ebensee. As the war was coming to a close, although the inmates themselves didn't know it, the Nazi guards tried to herd the thousands of inmates into a nearby tunnel where they intended to seal the entrance and destroy any witnesses to their crimes. En route to the tunnel entrance, the thousands of inmates noticed that the guards had changed into their civilian clothes, thus altering the external threat. To everyone's surprise, including the inmates, and despite the same menacing guards, now in civilian clothes, they refused to enter the tunnel and survived to tell the tale. The strength or perception of the external threat is a valuable variable which must be considered. Jasen's book is innovative, authoritative, and hopefully useful for the future evaluation of our forces as well as those of our enemies. More importantly, his cohesion theory is applicable to non-military groups as well, which can explain the past centuries whose events have brought us to this point. And that's what I've got to say about the use of the cohesion theory in the past. We can use this for the past as well as for the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'd like to say a few thank yous before I address some of these comments, which should give me some time to sort of reload and think about what I'm going to say. But I want to thank the Bush School and the Scowcroft Institute for organizing this event. I really appreciate it, and I'm touched to see everyone here. When you write a book, you pour your heart and soul into it, or you could think of it as passing a kidney stone, which is what I think I said in my acknowledgments before I took it out. I want to thank Victoria, my wife, for she was my real editor. I won't tell Jeffrey Byrne at Stanford that, but she read the manuscript 3 times. We had it in our kitchen in different piles, and she would scream at me about the use of passive voice. She's a ruthless editor and the love of my life. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to take time to thank the gloom in my life, and that's Chris Lane, who's been a great friend, mentor, and brother in despair as we watched our Dodgers go down to defeat to the St. Louis Cardinals yet again. So these 2 gentlemen have some great comments, and I think I'll go in the order they're presented. Austin, thank you for putting me up there with Shields and Janowitz. I cited them enough times, so maybe that's why you put me up there with them. But his comments about both of these scholars have some good comments about the theory's portability. And I should say something about when I started working on this project, which has grown out of my dissertation. I was lucky to be at the University of Chicago as a graduate student at a time where I had John Mearsheimer, Charlie Glazer, and Alex Wendt on my dissertation committee. And if you know anything about international relations theory, those 3 guys don't agree about anything. But because I was working on something that was inside the proverbial black box, they all came together and they all had a set of interests that were really helpful. And at the time, my office was outside of Alex Wendt's office. And so I was very interested in how, not just how you motivate militaries, but how you motivate groups in general. At Chicago, there seemed to be this conflict between the econ department and the sociology department. The econ department sees everyone as miniature firms who are selfish, and it's a great puzzle why people vote and why they cooperate with one another. Over at the sociology department, they talk about norms, they talk about ideology, but they can't shove it into a regression equation. So these two camps are separated, and what I try to do with cohesion theories is talk about militaries, but reconcile or solve a different puzzle, which is how do you get groups to take collective action, risk their lives, and do it together and sustain that action, even if they look like they're not going to win. So that's the kernel of the idea inside the book. Now, Austin raised three different issues that I think are worth addressing. Does the theory about the United States, does it apply to the United States today? Should we see the U.S. military perform in the same way we saw the U.S. military perform in Vietnam? I think you addressed this preemptively, which is the U.S. Army today is not a conscript army. And I think in some ways we learned the lesson of Vietnam that an all-volunteer force is going to have a different relationship between society than a conscript force. And in fact, when I roamed the halls of the Pentagon and talked to people about a conscript force during Iraq, no one wanted to touch it, right? The official argument is that a conscript force would have less skill than a volunteer force, but I think the other argument is that a conscript force would probably have less will because more people in society would be involved in the war. The military wouldn't be this entity that we see when we're going through BWI that we occasionally give our first class tickets to. It would be, all of us would be involved. The cost of war would be something we'd all share, and over time, I think that would have a negative effect on the cohesion of the military. Both of these scholars point to the fact that theory is portable, and I don't have a chapter on ISIS. I don't have a chapter. I have some hand-waving discussion at the end about the Iraqi army, but I think the next project I'm going to pursue is applying the theory to other militaries, more modern militaries, and even different groups. I mean, your comments about applying the theory to the Warsaw Ghetto and different concentration camps and looking at how they performed, whether or not they revolted, whether or not they could sustain a revolt, and these point to, I'm happy to see these kinds of comments because the kernel of the theory was that it's not just about militaries, and it's something that can apply to other organizations. Your other comment, Austin, was about does it apply to air forces and navies? I think it does, but I'm not going to bloviate enough to say with great certainty that it does. I think where it might apply is in the metrics. So in the social sciences, we're obsessed with measuring things. And if you look in the book, I have lots of tables to give it the veneer of science. And in the book, I look at land power, right? And so I have a lot of metrics associated with land combat. Because war is so complicated, I control or put aside air and naval power. But given the rise of the unmentioned near-peer competitor from the Great East, it probably would behoove me to go read some World War II history, naval history, some air history, and try to come up with some similar metrics. So in short, I think the theory applies, but I have to come up with some different metrics. Brother Kramer, you've inspired me to go look at some non-militaries, and not just non-state actors or terrorist groups or insurgent groups, but to look at civil disobedience and other social movements. It's a literature that I've engaged with a little bit in the theory chapter. I read a little bit of that during those long comparative politics exams we have to take at Chicago. And I'm thinking about the work of Sidney Tarot, who's written a lot about social movements and how some social movements keep going. The civil rights movement in general was pretty persistent, and other social movements sort of dissolve away. And interestingly enough, when a social movement collapses, a peaceful one, a nonviolent one, they tend to become violent because their conclusion is, well, nonviolence doesn't work, let's try violence. So you provided me some encouragement to look beyond military, beyond violent actors, and think about nonviolent movements. So thanks to you both for coming here and giving me some great, not only some the pat on the back, but some thoughts for future research. And I think for the gals now, we're going to do some Q&A, and then we'll stop talking. So thank you.
Good. So I'll ask the panelists to put their microphones on. It's right over your chair. There's yours. Okay, great. I'll take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question. And it's about this notion of ideology linking a force together, making it coherent, linking it to the leadership, right? How do we, I think almost every military, almost every state will put forward an ideological justification for its rule and for why its military should be loyal to it and serve the greater cause. So we can't rely simply on the verbiage that the state puts out, or even that the military puts out in its official documents, right? So how do we know when that ideological link is real, and how do we know when it's fake before we see the result? I think so.
So
Project.
Yeah. We've spoken to larger rooms than this, I know.
yes, but never in such a comfy chair. So when I first started this project, I was interested in ideologies which I would describe as collectivist, because they said the group always matters more than the individual, right? But then the problem is that ideology becomes cheap talk. It's not enough to say, we have this ideology, everyone should embrace it. And I was really motivated by McGregor Knox's book, Hitler's Italian Allies, right? Because in the book, he compares fascism in Nazi Germany to fascism in Mussolini's Italy. And the bottom line of the book is that Mussolini's fascism had better uniforms, they were first to fascism, but they were not as committed as Nazi Germany. And what I drew from the historical literature is that what separated the cheap talk of fascist ideology in Italy and Nazi Germany is that there was huge institutional control of Nazi Germany. Civil society basically disappeared, and the state was highly coercive. So there were some people who really believed in the ideology, and some people who had to pretend that they really believed in the ideology because they knew they would either be in prison or there was an enormous amount of social control. So you can't just look at society and see what their ideology states. You have to see if there are other material conditions in the background that create incentives for people to embrace that ideology. And that's what I try to do.
So the content of the ideology in the end
It's half the story.
Okay, so what kind of content works better than other kinds of content?
Content that emphasizes the group or the individual. So things like class, communism, nation, nationalism, some kind of ideologies based on theology, things that tend to emphasize external threat as another justification for the group being more important than the individual. And in a democracy, the group is more important than the individual, but that's contingent, right, if necessary. But we don't live for the state. And the societies I just mentioned, they live for the state.
I'm going to step down and ask for hands for questions. And I will play, for those of you who are of a certain age, I will play Phil Donahue.
Phil.
Hello. Dr. Castillo, I was wondering if you could...
Hello, Bill, man.
Hi, Mr. Thank you for talking about peace, by the way. I was wondering if you could speak to the idea of transition periods. And that, two things. One, do you see transitioning from one category to another as difficult or easy? Are they sticky or not? And the second thing is, if a country is going through a transition period with how its military is forming together, does that make them more or less vulnerable to conducting offensive operations?
That's a good question. The second one, well, let me address the first part. Yes, they do go through transitions, and if I could have had 40 or 50 more pages, the chapters on France and Germany would have been longer, because I would have looked at World War I and World War II together for both of those countries to demonstrate the transitions. And they're both very interesting, because in World War I, the French and German militaries they're about equally resilient, right? They're what I call professional militaries, and they both fight pretty hard. And then they both react to World War II, or World War I, and it's reflected in their performance in World War II. German ideology is all about avoiding 1918 again. That's probably why the coercive apparatus kept that state and that military going. If you want to see a good illustration of this, go rent the movie Downfall. You get a German military that's fighting hard and still taking time out to execute its own military for not fighting hard. So they drew a different lesson from World War I, which is never give up. Whereas the French military seemed to react differently. The journalist Walter Lippmann went and interviewed the French General Gamelin, who was in charge of French forces in 1939. He interviewed him and said, how many casualties do you think the French military can take in this next war, expecting a number similar to 1914 through 1918? And Gamelin said about 100,000. And his 1938 prediction was just about right. So yes, they do go through these transition periods. I haven't thought about exactly when they've completed those transitions, nor have I thought about whether or not they could go on the offense. I guess it depends on which box they end up, whether or not they'd be good at offensive military operations.
Dr. Castillo.
Brother Grimm.
I almost cried when Dr. Long brought up the question of what kind of tools can be used by other types of militaries to sort of break the messianic.
Oh yes, that was right. That was the third point that I brought
I'm
up.
going to ask the question again.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what are some of the tools you can use, and do you think like technology could be one of the things to bridge the gap, or do you think that's not?
Well, technology solves all of our problems. Just get the right UAV and then. So if we had PowerPoint, I do actually have a slide where I show, given the different categories of militaries, how you would want to defeat them. The short story is, if you're fighting one of those messianic militaries, you basically have to bring crushing material superiority. You basically have to shock them through attrition, right? And that means that it's not enough to show up at their capital and pull the statue down. You have to encircle these militaries and you have to destroy them. If you're fighting at the opposite end, the easy one, the apathetic militaries, then usually things like blitzkrieg, putting them in a bad situation, boxing them in a corner really usually cause them to capitulate. Professional militaries like the U.S. do really well on the battlefield. And if you want to break them, assuming that they have a conscript army, not an all-volunteer army, the best way to break militaries like that is to demonstrate that you're in a stalemate and that this isn't going to go anywhere. I think that is actually the strategy a lot of our insurgent enemies use, which is, we're just going to hang around, right? As long as we don't lose, we win, because we know that the stakes are more important here for us than they are for you. And we also know that you're not a messianic or authoritarian military. You don't have someone holding a gun to society's head to keep fighting. So as long as we don't lose, we win.
So the dean said that we had to read your book to defeat our enemies, but what we really have to do is keep your book out of the hands of our enemies so they won't realize that we're not a messianic army.
That's right. The prose is so turgid they probably wouldn't understand it anyway.
I'm sure the translations into Arabic are already.
Sure. Just in terms of the social control aspect, do you think there are opportunities, at least for maybe not, say, a North Korea full autarkic, we have no contact with the outside world, but are there ways, and this gets back to technology, but maybe not just technology, are there ways you can undermine or exploit vulnerabilities in the social control apparatus simultaneously? And I'm not talking about just sort of leaflet drops, because that's probably not going to do it, but are there ways you can exploit social media? I'm thinking maybe of
Twitter machine.
the Twitter machine, which is probably also not going to do it on its own, but maybe more sophisticated ways to ensure clandestine communication from
Right.
resistance groups, et cetera, that kind of stuff. More than just, enabling cheap talk against the regime, but actually enabling some undermining of the social control. Or is that, am I just getting too clever by half and hoping we can do things like that?
I'm pretty pessimistic about those things in general. We probably, if it's a regime, no, right? Like if I could go back in time and find some technological tool to undermine Stalin or Hitler, I don't think so.
What about Iran? Somewhere between them and a really friendly regime.
This is when I wish Brother Tabar was here, so I could defer to him, because he studies Iran. Again, I'm not optimistic about those things. Because we're not just talking about undermining the ideology. You guys have the wrong set of ideas. It's just you have a bunch of people who are invested in perpetuating that ideology. They've done a good job of neutralizing the opposition or any other elements of civil society that would oppose them. And so that's a pretty high bar to cross. But there may be regimes out there that pose, that look like they're really draconian, but then they're not. You know, there may be Mussolinis out there, right? But pretending to be Stalin, but they're not.
Arnold, can I ask you to follow up on one of the earlier points?
Sure.
You talked about external threat
Yes.
as a factor. And Jason, you didn't talk much about kind of the nature of, you talked about the organization itself, not about the surrounding circumstances.
Right.
Arnold, could you talk a little bit about how you see external threat playing into this? And Jason, could you react to that?
I think that external threat is an enormously important variable. How you perceive, how strong is the enemy? How do you perceive the enemy? The enemy may not be that strong, but you perceive them to be much stronger. That's got to influence your ability to fight in a unified group, or to rise up, in the case of the camps, to rise up against the camp guards. I think that the external threat is enormously important. I think we could make a case here about the external threat.
Do you think that, so the German army is Jason's kind of ideal cohesive, German Army World War II, ideal cohesive case. How important was the notion that was imbued from the Nazi takeover in the 30s that, you know, we've got this Soviet Union, right? They're huge, they're menacing, they have an ideology that's against us, their racial characteristics are going to you know, wash us out. How important was the idea of the Soviet threat to building this cohesion within Germany, do you think?
I think it was go ahead.
No, Arnold first, and then we'll get Jason.
Oh, I think it was very important. There, those Nazis who said that their entire, the creation of their whole system was as a pushback against the Soviets. In many cases, they aped the Soviets, trying to do what they did. I think that the Soviet Union was terrifically important. I think that when Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact in August of 1938, it was in fact an effort by both parties to subdue the other, or to hold the other one at bay. I think that they were both the nemesis to the other, and I think that the external threat to both was the other.
So Jason, why didn't you talk about external threats here?
One is I'm trying to confuse people, not in thinking that I'm not a realist. No, too much external threat going around. No, external threats are a big part of the argument, and that's why all these militaries face enormous external threats. And so the baseline I draw is, if you're a military and you're faced this great external threat, then how can we make comparisons about you? So they're all great powers facing great external threats. In the case of Germany, right, I just want to echo what Brother Kramer said, is the idea, and the small, easy, accessible book here is Hitler's War Aims, Norman Rich's book. It's all about this continuation of grabbing territory in Central Europe, the internal and external fight between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany has antecedents in German domestic politics in the 20s and the 30s, right? The Nazis could point to, these people are trying to interfere with our society. The communists, the left-wing revolutionaries in Germany are a giant threat. So I don't mean to suggest external threats don't matter, but the way I try to deal with it in the book is that if all these militaries face external threats, then how do we say something different about them? And then the tiebreaker has to be the internal characteristics.
Just to follow up though, I mean, you acknowledge that the U.S. is the exception, right? We face a large external threat in Vietnam, but it's not in Vietnam, it's this broader communist thing. So, and then the flip side is, of course, the U.S. looks even more ferocious if you're North Vietnamese. At least the Germans had some story about how they could beat the Soviet Union. It's tough to see the North Vietnamese, and yet we see very different results. So
Yeah. And methodologically, then that pairing works for me, right? Because
It's a strong form.
Yes, that's right.
If we didn't see the Japanese as a threat in World War II, I don't know if we would have turned against 120,000 Japanese in California. The external threat was menacing and immediate, and I think that the external threat's hugely important.
And it helps you identify, right? You need the other
Absolutely.
to identify
Absolutely.
and demonize.
Yes.
Question right here.
Okay, thank you. Professor Castillo, I'm hoping you'll speak a little bit to how this might apply to coalitions, as opposed to...
My first failed dissertation topic.
Okay, fair enough. But not just in terms of alliance, but in terms of these more sort of closer coalitions that we have today in Iraq and Afghanistan, as opposed to not just armies that fight wars together, but armies that fight battles together.
Right. It is a subject that interests me greatly. My short answer is that that's driven largely by external threat, and that's why when you look at Iraq and Syria today, I think you see different behaviors, right? We're sort of surprised that Turkey's not doing more to help, but that's because we're not wearing Turkey's shoes and we don't have the same set of interests when it comes to ISIS that Turkey or some of these other countries have. I think it's all, firstly, when it comes to alliance cohesion, it's about external threats and then your set of interests. And in the ISIS campaign, whatever our strategy is, there's just a variety of behaviors because everyone sees the problem differently. There are very few people who see the problem the same way as we do.
Hi, sir. That was literally my question, so I'll just say that I thoroughly enjoyed your book.
Oh, great. Am I allowed to ask you a question? No. That's on Tuesday. All right.
Similar question. If you've got two countries that are fighting a common enemy in relatively close proximity, was there any evidence that countries can export the components of cohesion theory to each other, either promoting professionalism in the less cohesive army or the less cohesive army maybe undermines regime control?
Well, I think, and these guys can speak to it too, there's always a lot of imitation that goes on in international relations, especially when there's a large external threat, imitation and innovation. I think one of the interesting things about the German and Soviet cases during the interwar period is that there was a lot of cooperation between the Soviets and the Germans on the subject of how to fight Blitzkrieg. Right? And so it's one of the great puzzles of why German military tactics and operations and Barbarossa were such a surprise in 41, because they had been talking about this since the early 30s. But to the Soviets' credit, they innovate and improve on Blitzkrieg by the time the war ends. So there's a lot of imitation and innovation that goes on in international politics.
Well, I think part of the story on the Soviet side is your autonomy variable, right?
Right.
When you kill off the Timoshenkos and all the guys that actually study with the Germans, it makes life hard. I think, though, that you do see maybe some of that, but even in the long haul, less than you might anticipate. So Afghanistan, we've been fighting in a coalition with most of the same cast of characters for 13 years now. And the other nations that were sort of, in that professional box alongside the U.S. military still look pretty professional. So I was last in Afghanistan in the summer of 2013. The Norwegians, very small contingent, still extraordinarily professional guys on their 5th, 6th, 8th rotation through, still very professional. The Italians, still pretty much the Mussolini story. I mean, not, nice guys, wear very cool black shirts, have great wine, but they were more or less tacitly paying the Taliban to just leave them alone. So you didn't see much emulation of the United States, but neither did we everybody would say what I just said about the Italians and move on with life. So I didn't see much either way in that context, because the threat from the Taliban is, it's of a nature that's not life-threatening to anybody's regime. You might have seen more change if the Taliban were, sort of marching on College Station.
But it was life-threatening to the Afghan regime, and we didn't see much cohesion there, right?
With the Afghan regime now?
Yeah.
It depends. I mean, there the cohesion is it's sort of intra-military, so that I assure you, the Tajiks of northern Afghanistan will fight to the death against the Taliban. The Pashtun bits, maybe not so much. So there, I think you have an army that will probably come apart into pieces, some of which will probably look more messianic, and others that will be apathetic.
But there we're getting right into identity rather than ideology.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if we're kind of, in the cases that you use, Jason, we're kind of, we set the identity issue aside because these are all fairly cohesive national entities, the United States, Germany. These are not ethnically, if you will, divided societies. I wonder if, have you thought about identity as a factor? Because it seems to me that, I mean, when we look at the Arab Spring, identity is a key factor in whether armies stay together or split apart, and kind of the identity of armies facing mobilized populations, right? If the army saw the population as us, they tended not to fire back. If the army saw the population mobilized against them as another sectarian group, right? Then they would fight them, right? They would kill them.
I really wanted to write a chapter on the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
We all want to write a chapter on the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
That's where I come in.
But I just refer you to, is it Istvan Dieck's book, The Habsburg Officer Corps? And the core argument there is, you know, we all make fun of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it stayed around for 4 years in World War I. It took a huge amount of casualties. So the puzzle is, why did it keep going? And the answer was,
My father was fighting.
right? He was leadership, right? But his argument is that it's the identity of the Habsburg Officer Corps. They saw themselves as the backbone of the empire. They identified with the empire first, and having that provided the backbone of the army. So then the puzzle becomes, can you do the same things in national armies? And because of identity politics, you see these sectarian militias fighting harder because they can identify with one another and not the state.